are. Dave, welcome to the stage. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks for having me, John. I really appreciate it.
Excited. We get to dig into customer involvement and incidents. It's a topic that's really interesting. I think it's when I think about where we're on the forefront, things that are still changing, where people have strong opinions, and I think it's just a great area for us to dive into a little bit.
Yep.
So you've got a really fascinating and unique career when it comes to merging these worlds of sort of the customer and the reliability engineer. And at Google, you were director of global customer cloud ops, right? Before you
hmm
became in charge of customer reliability engineering. So maybe we could kick off a little bit. If you could just give everyone in the audience a little bit of an overview of what exactly is CRE, right, as compared to SRE, and that definition, I think would give us a good place to start.
Well, so CRE is part of SRE. CREs are Google SREs, experienced Google SREs who face outwards towards customers instead of inward towards infrastructure. My first job at Google was to build and lead the cloud technical support team, which was interesting since I never worked a day in support in my entire life. But that's a different story, I guess. And after we started to get up and running and Google Cloud started to gain volume, a thing we were discovering is a non-trivial number of things that were being filed as bugs or incidents from customers were actually design problems. Or operations problems from customers. Many customers just assumed because a VM kind of looks like a regular computer that it's exactly like a regular computer, so they could just sort of lift the thing up and move it over, and it would all work fine. Or all the semantics, or particularly all the operational semantics, would be the same. And that's just not true. And those edges caused a lot of consternation for people. And I remember having a conversation with someone in I don't know, 2016 maybe, and saying, the problem here is we have to go attack this problem downstream, or this will never scale. Like, we'll just get eaten up with things that we actually can't fix. If a customer operates a thing that best case scenario is 3 nines, because maybe their logging's not good, or their monitoring's not good, or their paging's bad, or their operational practices are no good, or whatever, could use improvement, let's say. It doesn't matter if they come to your 5 or 6 or 12 9 cloud. They're good. Their actual experience is going to be slightly less than 3 nines, right? They are the gate. So I had this idea, I guess, that what we ought to do? We should not only teach our customers how to SRE. You got to remember, this is 2016. We had only just really started talking about SRE publicly at Google. I think the first book had maybe just come out, and catch these things downstream, and then the other nutty part of it is the reward for customers is we'd actually share pagers with them. And everyone thought it was insane, and I'm sure it sounded insane to everybody. A rather household name told me very politely, he's a good friend of mine, he told me, this is insane. You'll never recruit experienced SREs to want to go do this. Engineers don't like to talk to customers, which is a fallacy. It's completely not true. Engineers want to talk to customers. It's very satisfying. They're just afraid. They don't know how to. It's actually not as hard as you think. And so that's how CRE got started. And I left Google's support formally and joined Google's SRE org and built the CRE extension to it, which continues to this day.
So what did, like, internally, it sounds like you had some initial pushback on this in terms of, like, is this a good idea? I think you originally wrote a manifesto, right, in order to kind of publicize this, which I think is public now, right?
Yeah, yes, it is public.
So if we take away that part, like, what did customers initially think about this? Like, when you were just getting going with this idea, and you chose, I imagine, a few customers, and you said, look, we're gonna share your pages. Like, were there barriers, in terms of, like, what you had to get them over to say, well, we're willing to do this? Like, how did you bring the customer in? Did they even understand that engagement? Like, internally, I can see this being a challenge at Google, but externally, it must have just seemed like completely out of left field.
No, customers. So the first reaction from every customer was joy. What? A Google human is going to take a pager for my application? Sign me up. I would love to do this. And then you have to teach them the fine print, which is, wait a minute, that's the end of the journey, right? There are a bunch of things we will have to do together for you to earn that right. For us to connect to your dashboards and take pages on your behalf. And, and that's where the hard work is. The terrible analogy I always used to use with people was, imagine you wanted to train to run a marathon. You'd never run a marathon before. And someone came along and said, I'm a really good personal trainer. And for no money, because we never charged for CRE, and I'll explain why in a minute, I'm willing to train you, and I'm going to give you access to my gym. And here are the rules. You have to show up every day. You have to do the work earnestly, and you have to follow the diet. If you stop showing up, or you slack off, or I catch you eating Krispy Kremes or something, you're going to lose access to the gym. I'll move on to somebody else, right? Who's somebody who's actually serious. And so maybe you're like, great, I want to run the New York Marathon or something. And you show up for a month, and maybe the first thing is you get on the scale, and you're like, whoops, yep, I weigh too much. All right. And you go for a month, and maybe all you do is you go for a month. You don't get very close to the goal of being able to run a marathon, but you've weighed yourself and maybe lost a few pounds. You're better off, or you go for longer, et cetera. Right, so you can extend that bad analogy kind of infinitely. That was the deal we always had with customers. We will take your pages with you eventually, but there are a lot of things we have to do in between now and then before it's reasonable for that to be true. And you have to be able to commit to the effort to do it. And when we see you not committing to the effort, we're going to shake your hand, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you, and then we're going to move on to somebody else, which is why we never charged money for CRE. We launched it so we preserved the right to hand back the pagers, which at least in Google is a really important incentive for SREs. SREs at Google can hand back the pagers to the dev team if the dev team is not being a good partner in fixing operational issues, which is, that's how that balance works. And so the challenge wasn't getting customers excited. That was easy. They were thrilled at the idea. The challenge was making them understand the quality of work they were going to have to do and what the journey looked like. And we did. We had plenty of cases where we'd start with a customer and they're enthusiastic, and we get a little bit down the way, and then we get deprioritized, right? Because it would. And they'd stop and we go, okay, great, we're going to walk away now. And then they'd come back after some major incident that they had, and they're like, okay, I guess we should continue to do this. And it was that kind of thing. So sometimes you get in shape because you have goals. Sometimes you get in shape because you have a heart attack. And there was a lot of that. And so there was a lot of managing that stuff. That's really where the issue was. There was no resistance from customers about the idea of wanting to do this. They all love it.
So I'm just going to pause really quickly. For everyone watching, we're going to use the Q&A field again here in this talk as well. So if you have questions for Dave as we go, I've got a pile in front of me that we can walk through. But if you've got other questions or challenges, Dave told me coming into this that he was open to any questions that you can come up with in this space. Feel free to drop them in there, and I'll pick them up as we go along. But Dave, that's really interesting. So from the standpoint of you get joy followed by almost like a hill that has to be climbed of, okay, and you get this joy in exchange for these things that aren't dollars, which I imagine did an interesting job of sort of setting the customer profile that you worked with. If we go forward a little bit though, so now you're sharing pagers, now you're being alerted at the same time as a customer during a major incident. What happens with accountability, during that incident between like customer and you as a provider? I think a lot of SaaS products as they exist today really stand in a world of, you'll fire off an email and then behind the scenes, you have no idea what's happening, right? You don't know the severity level it's been given. You don't know if it's going to be done soon.
That's part of the contract, right? You can think of it in a sense as joint operations. So like one of the preconditions to sharing pagers is you have to understand roles and responsibilities. Like, where's the water's edge? Which part of this shared monitoring do we have? Am I the customer responsible for? And which squiggle is Google, in this case, responsible for? And you got to have, that's a contract. You have to draw with the teams about what's your operational guide. But if you think about it, it's not much different than the kinds of things you have to work out internally, right? Between your platform team and your feature team or your backend data team, or it's all very similar in that case. Like, you're just talking to engineers. I mean, there's some complications because you're working across corporate boundaries for sure, but those are mainly the new complications. But yeah, you got to have those. You have to set that up and trial run it. Excuse me. And you're constantly renegotiating those boundaries a little bit. But the advantage for the customer is they get a lot more real-time insight. Here's the thing I always used to tell people. They're like, what do you mean we're going to take pagers for customers? And my answer was, you already take pagers for customers. You just take it with less data and later when they're annoyed. Why wouldn't we want to, people who have worked with me over the years get annoyed because I say this all the time. I don't believe in small problems. I believe there are only big problems that haven't had enough time. And by the time an SRE and a cloud provider finds out a customer's in pain, the customer's in a lot of pain. Like they're very, very annoyed, and it's hard to have the kind of conversation you want to have because everyone's hair is on fire. If you're sharing a dashboard and you're getting simultaneous alerts, or even better, you as a partner, as a provider, can see an anomaly the customer's maybe not paying attention to and go figure out if it's you first and then tell them proactively, hey, we think you may have a problem that's on your side of the fence because we've already looked at this. Like that is a delightful customer experience that will absolutely save you getting woken up at 3 a.m. a little later in the day.
So before this world of CRE, where I guess we were thinking more sort of traditional, right, support ops. What was the customer's perception of their ability to understand like how important the problems they're being submitted to you were? Because you were running some degree of support ops before this, right?
Yeah, I
Before
was running all the
CRE.
cloud support, sure, and
Yeah, which
which
I
is a
imagine
very
is where
traditional.
most companies are today, right? Is sort of
Mhm.
they have like an inbound perception, and they make changes, and they're feeding back, I guess, through customer success. Like, do you think there's a moment that has to switch over? Do you think small companies can do this and like still absorb that type of additional potential work?
Yeah, so I gave a talk at IRConf. She's got to be 5 years ago now, probably 2017. And the thesis of the talk was all of you in this room are going to do CRE at some point for your customers. You're all going to share pagers with your customers. And I went through a whole argument why that is, and I really do believe it. And it comes from the fact that all successful companies are eventually platform companies. Everyone, it's business physics. And once that's true, your customers have an they treat you like a platform, and they build on you in ways maybe you hadn't expected. And they come to have expectations about how you're going to operate. And so they are eventually going to contact you when their expectations are not being met. And if that's the first time you're learning that they're doing things in a particular way, it's really like, think about what you have to do. You have to do all the discovery, learn how they're, doing the architecture or whatever, how they're operating it, what the error means, what it means in their logs, how their stuff is set up, all the things you don't know. You got to learn all that in the context of this incident that's on fire for them, and you have to have a mitigation. And so a lot of times companies just wind up smashing buttons until they can get the pain to stop, and then they can go sort of analyze things. It's painful. Like all the work is at the end when it should just be, you should be distributing, over the life of your relationship with the customer. Now, not every customer is going to rise to that bar. Not every customer is going to want to do the work of being able to share a dashboard with you or share logs with you or sensitive incident data with you. I mean, most of them probably won't. And that's okay. But even if they don't, the mere fact that they know that they could, if they were willing to do the work, is good for you, right? Because they know that there's some valve. You're not just some void they're screaming into. They could get to that extra level of relationship, and that's comforting for customers. So just the fact that it's possible is good for your customers. But yeah, I have this belief that since every company is eventually a platform company, and I do think that that's true, it means your customers are going to use you as a platform. They're going to have expectations, even ones you did not document, which means all of us are going to be in this role at some point where we want to have, at least with our highest volume or highest revenue or most important, however you want to think about it, customers, where we have much tighter loops with them that begin to look a lot like shared operations. It's just, I think, a natural evolution.
So it's happening anyway. We're wrapping process around it and formalizing it. Yeah.
Acknowledge it, embrace it, and make it not painful. It's a lot like what Emily was talking about in the keynote, right? You want to take as many things as you can and get them early so they're boring when you find them and not emergencies when they just show up.
I'm going to jump to a question here from the crowd. Andy's asked, does this CRE model, scale down to internal teams in a typical microservice architecture?
I have to. It's a good question, Andy, but I do have to giggle a little bit at the phrase typical microservice architecture. Yeah, sure, it scales down, but you're already doing it, is my point, right? So if you are an internal platform team and you're publishing, 50 services to all your feature teams, and they're all it doesn't matter if they're monoliths or microservices, that part's not as important in this. you're already establishing these boundaries, right? When something happens, the feature team is like, the platform's breaking, the platform team's like, no, you implemented it wrong. Like, you're already having these discussions and these arguments. All this is the SRE model, as has been now, comprehensively described in the public space, and extending it to teams that are not inside your corporate umbrella. The way I always like to think of it was, we're just extending it to teams that, instead of meeting in the org chart at your CEO, meet at the org chart at God. That's it. That's the difference here. So I guess my argument is, this is already the SRE model for internal teams. Now we're talking about teams that are external to the company.
I'm going to jump back and forth a little bit from some of the pre-prepped questions here and the crowd
Right.
questions. So just bouncing back to sort of an extension of what you were talking about before, where you're making the determination of who really gets to be part of this, right, from the bar that you're setting. How do you balance that inside, especially if you think about like small startups that are growing, that are trying to prioritize some of their early revenue? How are you balancing those desires and needs from the business? Are you having customer relationship managers, reaching out and saying, it doesn't matter if they're hitting this bar, like you're gonna share their pager anyway because we need this account? Like,
No,
how did you manage that type of situation?
Yeah, so you had to. That's a relationship. Those are relationships you had to build internally with your sales leadership. You had to get their sign off, or the whole thing isn't going to work. It's why CRE sat in SRE and didn't sit in professional services. Let's say it's why we never charged money for CRE. It's why it was never a line item in a contract where we promised someone access to CRE. How a company works is individuals with the company. Me personally, the way I chose to do that when I was at Google is I added myself as a contract approver for these deals. And anytime I'd see in the contract, and you'll get CRE, the answer was no. You'll get the opportunity to engage with CRE, which is different. So you have to have an honest conversation with your sales leadership. They just can't promise it, otherwise it's unpaid professional services, and the whole model falls apart at that stage. In terms of who gets it and who doesn't, I was left that to the sales teams. I was described, look, this is the level of work. Why don't you decide how you would like to, because it's a scarce resource. There are always going to be many fewer CREs than there will customers. So it's a scarce resource. You decide how you want to prioritize customers who should have this opportunity, but all they get is an opportunity. So what you do is you create a queue, you prioritize the customers you would like to have this opportunity, and then we'll go interview them. And we'll talk to them for a couple of days about what it really takes and how you get to a state where we're sharing dashboards and sharing pagers. And we'll try to gauge whether we think they seem earnest in their commitment, right? Basically, can they identify an owner, and what team do they want to start with? A bunch of questions you can ask to kind of gauge someone's. It's like prospecting in sales, whether someone's a real buyer or not. And the ones who seemed earnest, okay, whoever ranked highest, whoever passed the earnest bar and ranked highest on sales's list of people who should get it, then, well, they got the first crack at it. And the ones who didn't seem earnest, we go back to the sales team and say they're not serious about this yet. We got pretty good at detecting that early on with folks. But I always left it to the sales team. We have this much capacity. You please feel free to prioritize it in your dream, sort of your wish list any way you want to. And then we'll just work down the list. And people who seem earnest, who seem like they want to do the work, we will absolutely start there. No problem. And I don't know, I was probably personally having that conversation with customers 10 times a week, at the end of my run in CRE, and God knows how many times it was across the team, maybe 50 customers a week we're having that talk with.
Oh, wow. So the sales team had some ability to help the prioritization, which helped them make sure people were in that queue. But then you had ultimate authority in the CRE team to make that determination, right? Whether or not they were in.
Yep.
That's great around like the standpoint of just breaking down those silos of even communication. I think a lot of SRE teams don't even know the folks who are in the sales orgs.
No, exactly. And that's silly. Like, they go sell things. They're the reason you can go to your, the cafe in your office and eat your favorite brand of quinoa or whatever. I mean, like, they're the reason you have a job, because no one's going to pay you to write software that nobody buys.
So another question from Joshua here. He said, what's your false positive rate? Like, how often did you get paged for things that, had you not had the pagers, never would have bubbled up to you?
Again, we don't share the pagers until we have common agreement about escalation paths and shared monitoring. So by the time someone got to the place where we were actually sharing pagers, where we were sharing dashboards, data was flowing in between the companies, and the pagers were ringing on both sides of the fence, the false positive rate was really, really low. And in any case, in that condition, it will always be lower than the ticket rate, right? It's relatively cheap, let's say, for a customer to file a support ticket. And then some percentage of those are going to get escalated. And if you want to think of it as the false positive rate from your inbound support tickets is always, if you're doing this right, is always going to be a lot higher than the false positive for your actual pager rate, if you've set that up correctly with customers. Because they got a bunch of quality bars the data has to pass through before you get to that place.
How did you ultimately look at measuring this from a success standpoint? So where you're measuring, you were talking about nines earlier and sort of the number of nines that the customer has and sort of the difference between that is perception of their customers, right? Regardless of if they're on a high number of nines on the platform inside of Google. When you're then measuring this on the other side, are you measuring sort of the same types of reliability stats that you would otherwise be measuring inside of SRE? Are you measuring?
Absolutely.
Is there some? Okay.
Yes. In fact, executives, when back in the day when Diane Green was running Google Cloud, before Tom Securian joined us, there was a large TV outside of her office, like right outside of her office, a big monitor that was showing current availability statistics for large customers, which, if you think about it, is data most companies don't have because they can say it for their infrastructure or whatever, their storage system. But they can't say what it is from a customer's point of view, except, as these things went on, we started to be able to do that. And so we could say, and so she could look out her door and go, oh, so-and-so Corp looks like maybe they're having a thing. Let me go find out from the key account team what's going on there and whether I need to be calling someone in there. And just imagine that for a minute, right? Some senior executive from your cloud provider reaches out to you first and says, hi, I'm Dave. I'm the VP of engineering at wherever. And I'm calling because our monitoring says you might be having a challenge. We're already looking at it on our side, but I want to, make sure you know how to reach me and know that we're working on it. Like, how much of a better experience is that than if you're paying some company a pile of money for infrastructure and you have to file a ticket and you have to escalate and you have to escalate again and it's got to go through a shift change and then finally you get to talk to someone 3 days later.
Who else inside of the organization, you gave this example of, right, the TV outside, who else inside of the organization, was CRE the primary responding group, or other parts of the organization coming in and also becoming available and visible to the customers during those incidents?
Sure. Well, CRE was always the customer-facing interface along with the regular support team. It's not a good idea. It's not helpful, I guess I would say. So let's say, just trying to think about things that were public. So let's say we saw something in a graph, and it turned out at the end of the day, BigQuery was having a problem in the infrastructure. Okay, and it was some deep in the infrastructure thing. The SRE on call there, who we are working with to figure this out on the Google end, is not likely going to be talking to the customer. They're not trained to do it. They didn't wake up that day thinking that's a thing they might do, And so we're mediating that conversation, which is the reason why for CRE, at least, back when we kicked it off, back when I was involved with it, we only hydrated reasonably long tenured Google SREs into the CRE team. We never hired externally into that team ever, because you had to have the credibility to say, like, yeah, I've run operations for some part of this infrastructure. And I have
this was a career progression for people to come in and be part of the CRE.
And so that was the thing I think that surprised a lot of people internally is the conversation really went like this. I don't think he'll mind me telling the story, so I will. So I went to Ben Trainer-Sloss, who runs SRE at Google. He founded it. If you're in the SRE space, you certainly know who Ben Trainer is. And I had known Ben for a long time, and I was running support. And I came to him and I said, I have this problem I'm noticing, and I can only think of one solution to solve it, but it seems nutty to me. He's like, all right, what is it? And so I explained to him the problem about customers having a customer operations getting in the way of their own running things well. And I told him about this idea about CRE. And he looked at me and he said, well, you're about to learn a valuable lesson. You have come to me with a problem that now that you have told it to me, I can't unsee. You're right. It's a problem. And you have proposed the only credible, albeit definitely nutty, solution about how to address this. So congratulations. I want you to go hand off support. You're going to go, this is your new full-time job. Go do this. He said, but I'm going to tell you, I don't think this is going to work. He wasn't quite that bad, but you know, something very much like that, much more polite. And I said, why not? And he said, for this to really be effective, you need to populate this team with senior SREs who have been at Google for a while because they know the infrastructure really well and they can speak with some expertise to it. And you'll never get those people to want to talk to customers. And I said, I will happily bet you a sum of money that at least I can afford that you are wrong. Like, I will wager you that you are wrong. And he's like, explain to me why I'm wrong. And here was my thesis, which did turn out to be true. So the more senior you get in your career, the more the success of your career is judged by the impact you have, right? Influencing through other people to have large impact in your company or whatever. And in big companies like Google or any other place, like, that's the rubric for judging whether the difference between whether someone is a senior engineer or a staff engineer or a senior staff engineer or principal, et cetera, its impact. And by the time you get to, fellow or VP equivalent in most companies, you're looking for industry level impact. So if you're a very senior person, you've been through the infrastructure a bunch, you've already crawled into most of those atoms. Now, this is an opportunity to have business impact, not just on the company you work for, but all of its key customers. And every single senior person I had to do no recruiting once that manifesto got published. People called me from inside SRE and said, I'd like to go do this because I can clearly see this is how I widen my impact outside of the four walls of Google. And so if anything, we had to sort of waitlist people to join the team.
So your manifesto, your publishing and establishing of this problem as being something that has that degree of impact, just attracted people into it as opposed to having to go and individually sell.
Yeah, well, I think it was a combination of things. So it was, every company culture is different. In Google culture, manifestos are not uncommon. You have an idea, you want to raise a flag and put a stake in the ground. And I wrote it and I had no idea how it would be received, if anyone would read it. I don't know. I wrote it because I guess I would say I wrote it because I was annoyed and felt like I had to write it down. I was just, sometimes you get a problem that bothers you and you have to say, I think this is a problem. And I think part of it is the initial reaction of people who read it was, this solution seems insane. I think they all had Ben's reaction, which is an entirely logical reaction, that this solution seems insane. And so in a sense, I think I won't say viral, but it got passed around a lot. Because people were like, and then the camps over a couple of days started to split, where some people would be, this is insane, it'll never work camp. And other people were commenting in the doc like, well, I mean, it seems kind of insane, but wow, if you could make it work, it would be amazing. And it kind of went through this loop. And before you knew it, so many people had been reading the doc that when I went into Google Docs internally to ask it how many people have read this doc, which is the thing you can ask in Google Docs, it literally said, this doc is so popular, I can't give you that number right now. It was, or something like that, whatever that error, there's an error message for it.
Crossed into viral level.
Yeah, whatever viral corporate meme status is. I don't know what that is. And, that wasn't a plan. I just wrote it down because I was annoyed at a problem and I couldn't figure out how to solve it. It was the only way I could think of it. And then, of course, the sales and marketing folks loved it. You can think about it as a differentiator, right? I mean, we'd be talking about Google versus whoever, Amazon or Microsoft or something. And I'd remind customers, I'd say, what kind of system do you want to build? And so it needs to be 5 nines. Okay, well, most people don't actually need a 5.9 system. I'm like, but how about let's start with something less ambitious. Let's start with a 4.9 system. A 4.9 system can have 4.32 minutes of unavailability in a 30-day window. 3.9 system can have 43.2. A 5.9 system can have 26 seconds, basically. So let's take a 4.9 system. You can have 4.32 minutes of unavailability in a 30-day window in a 4.9 system. If the way you talk to your cloud provider is you file a support ticket, they go look at stuff, and maybe it's their problem and maybe it's yours, and you sort it out together, and then it's fixed, or at least it's mitigated. How many of you think you can do that in 4.5 minutes? The answer is you can't. You can only do it. And so I used to tell customers, so without a relationship like this, you can only build a 4.9 system. Forget 5.9. You can only build a 4.9 system using a cloud, using someone else's infrastructure with luck, and then eventually you'll burn your nines just in your support tickets. And they're like, well, I won't use the word they would use, but because it's being recorded, but darn, you're right. Like I can't, like that arithmetic is true. Like there's no arguing it. It's absolutely true. And they'd go, well, my other cloud provider choice, whoever it was, doesn't offer this and isn't going to offer this relationship to me. And so the sales and marketing team were like, ooh, we would like to talk about this a lot. And so they were the ones who eventually said, hey, why don't we, sort of edit out all some of the internal stuff that was, because there was a bunch of internal stuff in the manifesto. And why don't we publish it as a public post? And we did, and it was very popular with customers.
That's really fascinating to just sort of take that, make it external, give people that visibility into the way that you're going to treat them differently, and really commit to it, right? Beyond just we're going to try this out and state this is a direction we're going to go. I'm curious what this is a Google scale, right? Where they can take that bet, they can take these big bets and throw capital behind it. Like is there a lightweight version of this for a small company that's currently operating in sort of traditional authority?
Yeah, you're already doing it. This is the point I'm trying to, I try to make to people. All right, so I work at Pendo, and Pendo is not Google. Google's got whatever 160,000 employees, and Pendo's got a little less than 1,000. And we have to do it even here too. Like what always happens, even if you're actually when the smaller you are, the more this is true. That's the funny thing, is you're always doing this as a very small startup, and you kind of get away from it. Then eventually you have to go back to it. So as a very small startup, right? You spend all your time, you're building a thing, and your entire life is about market fit. Am I fitting the market? And then you get a couple of big customers, and like 3 customers are 80% of your revenue. That's a stage every company goes through. And you get as close as you possibly can to those customers. You're on weekly calls for sure, maybe daily calls. You're sharing data with them you wouldn't normally share because like they're your entire business. And we only ever really get away from that as we widen our customer base. We're like, oh, that's not scalable. You totally can't do it. But we all started doing it that way because each customer was 15 minutes of being upset away from not being a customer, which would meant death for you as a company. And so to me, that's sort of the ironic thing is when we're small as companies, we're doing this already. And guess what? No matter what size you are at a company, you're doing this already, just informally, with your top N customers, whoever your top 3 or 5 or 10 or whatever it means to you as a company. And so
this is a mistake that manifests as you grow, not
it's a natural I mean, it's I start to say it's an evolution. It's not really true. It's always there from the beginning. I think the thing that was always head scratchy to me, like once sort of sort that out, the thing that was a head scratchy to me is, oh, wait a minute, we've been doing this forever. Like we were doing this from the beginning, all of us, every one of us. And so since that's true, like let's give it a name and put some rigor behind it and put some process behind it, and maybe some first principles and some rules of the road, because we all do it now and it's ad hoc. So, I mean, how about let's do it less ad hoc?
We've got a question here in the audience. It's an easy one. Just what was the name of that manifesto? I think folks are trying to look it up.
Oh, I think if you're looking public, I think you probably have to go to the Google Cloud blog and look for a doc that's like introducing customer reliability engineering. I think it was very cleverly titled.
It's like just checking on Google here. It looks like it's the first result if you search for customer reliability engineering.
Wow.
Sorry, the first non-ad result. It's the first non-ad result is introducing Google Customer Reliability Engineering, CRE.
Yep.
So that'll jump you right in there. All right. So this is fascinating. So lots about getting the customer closer, giving them visibility in both directions, acting like you're there as a partnership, with those customers going forwards. I'm curious, did you run into any like toxic blockers here, like any situations with these customers that you didn't prepare for with your initial list of, requirements to make sure that you're part of this, that through this thing to just put it at risk, right? Which I imagine they come out of nowhere, but now you're working with a customer and you've hit like toxicity when you were trying to provide, mutual engagement.
Yeah, I would say the biggest reason we would walk away from a customer is because we would get to a manager or a leader of some kind, someone in a position of authority who wanted to stonewall the whole thing because they didn't want their dirty laundry to be public. They, which I guess is a very human kind of a thing. It's just a very short-sighted kind of, like, your laundry is going to be public when your thing doesn't work. Um, but yeah, that was, I think, the number one. It wasn't that. Let me disabuse people of this notion. It certainly wasn't because the engineers in a traditional enterprise were somehow less qualified than the Silicon Valley. That's like a myth in Silicon Valley, which is garbage. Like, these people have been building computer systems for decades that work. Some of them that operate for decades. Like, that's excellent engineering. So it was never that. It was never a lack of skill. It was a lack of will, and usually a lack of will among some middle or upper middle manager who felt like this was a path to be embarrassed instead of a path to be improved. Okay, I can't do anything about your pride. We disengage, we say thank you, we write down all the things we learned, we give it to the people who are interested, and then when your business discovers you're not willing to admit your mistake, they will decide you need to go find something else to do with your life, and then we will deal with your successor. And I will say that happened many more times than once.
Speaks a lot to the idea of openness, right? Even within companies and outside companies, and fear of admitting wrong being a barrier to any incident management, right? That people are willing to bring in. I remember when the book was published in 2016, and just the idea of kind of taking incidents and making them more open and having process behind them, as opposed to just treating them as things where our goal is they never happen, so we shouldn't need process around it.
That's
right?
the worst goal in the world. It drives me nuts when I talk to people and they're like, we should have zero downtime. And it's like, can you please name me anything a human being has ever built with 100% availability or reliability, whichever you'd like to measure? And I'll go further. Can you name me anything in nature with that? Just one thing. Name me any one thing. There's nothing you can name. It doesn't exist. It's like, that only exists in a static world, and we don't live in a static world. I mean, those kinds of goals are nuts to me. And you know what happens when you have goals of perfection of any kind? You teach your employees to be liars.
Yep.
That's what happens. That is, you teach your employees to lie to you. And that just means that you will fail slowly until you don't. And it'll look catastrophic and sudden to you, but in fact, it will have been rot that occurred over some number of years. And all
this is like when you set incident metrics, right, at like low numbers, and it just encourages, don't file the incident at all, file it late, misrepresent it, put it into a different system.
In the early days of support, I was having a conversation with a leader who was not long at Google thereafter. And they asked me, they said, why isn't CSAT, customer satisfaction for the support team at 100%? It was, I don't remember, it was 92 or 95% or something like that. And I looked at this person and I said, because we don't hire liars and we don't want them to lie to us? Like, it says, because it's not possible? How's that? I mean, it's just, and it's all the same thing. You can't expect zero problems and zero downtime. The best you can hope for is that whatever mistake you make, here's the thing I tell people all the time. It is no sin to fail. The sin is failing to notice. Like, don't spend your time asking, how am I going to build a thing that never goes down? That's dumb. Don't do that. Spend your time saying, how can I discover quickly I'm having a problem, and what will I pivot to if it turns out to be wrong? Because when you lower the blast radius of your individual mistakes, the closer you push them towards zero. They're never zero, but the closer you push them towards zero, the higher you push the amount of risk tolerance you have. And guess what? It's a much better world if you succeed by running out of ways to fail, rather than sitting there scared that exactly this path that you've carved out has to work perfectly. That's a terrible way to live. It's also just not realistic. The world doesn't work that way.
How early do you think we are in this industry of having the concept of CRE outside of a place like Google? So you're on the other side now. So you're not at Google anymore. I assume you consume other cloud provider resources. And do you find yourself experiencing more of this customer opportunity sort of to engage with your providers now, or do you feel like we're still kind of at the first inning of this in terms of other people recognizing it and adopting it?
I think it's early, to be honest, with all cloud providers. Well, let's call them third-party infrastructure providers, whether you can think of them as cloud providers or whatever. It feels like an expensive and unnatural motion to them. And it will never be normal for every customer of every provider, because there aren't the volume of people in your chosen provider who There's just not supply and demand, right? So this is going to be a thing that that providers do to protect as much of their revenue as they can. That's, they're going to focus on the large customers or the high profile customers, or however you want to think about it. And so for some companies, if you're not a material part of your provider's revenue, this will never be an opportunity for you. That doesn't mean, though, you can't do your half of it, because to the extent you can share your monitoring, share a page from your monitoring, or share some of your logs, and make it automatic and easy, even for the support engineers you're talking to look at the stuff, to the extent you can share architecture diagrams about how you reasoned about your systems, at a minimum, that makes all your support cases go faster. Like, there are things you can do on your side of the fence that I can do on my side of the fence, or you can do on, to make all those things easier, even if your provider never takes a pager with you. But they all will take a pager with you eventually. It's just, how many escalations you have to go through before it happens.
Well, wonderful. Well, we're just about running out of time. I'm just taking a look over here on the Q&A list to see if there's anything else that we've missed. Just one or two that just came in. Sorry, just reading quickly. Oh, this is, I don't want to go too deep onto this one, but I'm going to touch on it. So when on the incidents themselves, and what we can focus on the customer supplied incidences, right? Like, how do you still tie the consequences to those incidents while being blameless? So especially when a customer is involved, right, and you're dealing with, okay, it turns out to have been their fault, or it turns out to have been a very, visible now that you've done your root cause analysis, who's caused.
So
how do you make sure that stays a blameless culture, even maybe if the customer doesn't have that as ingrained as you do at Google?
So you never use the word fault unless you mean, a circuit that's had a short, in it. No. You always talk about these things as unlucky humans, where the system had a bug someplace, had a design failure, or the environment changed around it such that it exposed a weakness, or whatever. So all you're talking about is, who was the unlucky human who accidentally tripped over this? Because that's all it is. Because it could have just as easily been somebody else. It's not because they're stupid or lazy or evil or some nonsense like that. It's got nothing to do with that. They just happened to be unlucky. They just lost the lottery that day. And so maybe the unlucky human was, on your provider's side of the fence, or maybe the unlucky human was on your side of the fence. Or in a lot of cases in these things, the failure is an emergent property across a bunch of things. That's the thing you have to reinforce to people. It's one of the early things you teach them when you're going on this journey with them too, is you can't blame humans. That's dumb. Back when we had conferences in person, I used to do this thing all the time where, if, I had more than, say, 100 people in an audience, I'd be talking about this, and then I'd say to everyone, okay, raise your left hand, please. Then I'd take out my camera and take a picture. And then a few minutes later in the talk, when I was talking about why humans never execute anything reliably, it's not in our nature to do it, actually, I'd pull up the picture and project it, and it was a metaphysical certainty that if I said raise your left hand, a solid 20% of the crowd raised their right hand. Now, it's the simplest instruction in the world. Everyone knows they're left from right. But it happened every time, reliably. And so blame is dumb. It doesn't make any sense. If you think your engineer is actually incompetent, okay, that's a different thing. But that is so rarely true, like way less than 1%. So we always talked about, it's one of the first things you teach a customer when you go on this journey, is you can't say blame is not the right thing. It's, where was the unlucky human, and what do we have to do to the system so the next human who walks through this field doesn't step on this landmine? That's the only healthy way to deal with it. Otherwise, you teach people to be afraid and hide things, and then nothing gets better.
I love the idea of the labeling, right? Of, instead of the labeling of the even the owner or the marked as the reporter, you have the like unlucky person, who tripped over this wire today. It's a great way to describe it. Dave, thank you so much for joining us today. This is a great conversation. I think you're right. I think this is an emerging space. I think it's wonderful for everyone who's here in the crowd today to hear about your journey, coming from customer ops through to creating the CRE, through to now going to Pendo and being on the other side of that. And I think still watching out for customers. So really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today.